Pursuant to to the order of reference received from the House on Wednesday, November 2nd, 2016, the committee will resume its study on M39, Immigration to Atlantic Canada. And I'd like to welcome from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Mr. Jordy Morgan, from the Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador, and that's by video conference, and from the Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador, Ms. Juanita Ford, welcome. And from the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies, Mr. Marco Navarro-Genie, the President and Chief Executive Officer, by video conference as well. Welcome to our committee, and we'll begin with statements from Mr. Morgan. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to be here today and provide CFIB's perspective on the Atlantic Growth Strategies Immigration Pilot. CFIB, as you may know, is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization representing 109,000 small and medium-sized businesses across the country, representing all sectors of the economy. We take direction solely from our members, and I'm going to share with you, rather quickly I will say, some surveys that we've taken throughout the year and some of the data that we have for you. The first slide that you will see is on SME priority issues, and I think that you'll understand why we're showing you this, as the shortage of qualified labor is one of the largest issues facing SMEs in this country at around 45%. The next slide you'll see is CFIB's business barometer, and I wanted to note Atlantic Canada's small business confidence has shown some slow but steady progress since last fall. Short-term hiring plans are consistent with the trends that we see at this time of year. The chart you have in front of you is the Canadian index, but there are some seasonal factors now that are contributing to slight improvements throughout the Atlantic region. As I noted a little bit earlier, labor availability is very important to SMEs, and while some dispute there is a labor skills shortage in Canada, our members indicate that this is a serious and growing shortage of qualified people in many sectors in many regions in the country. And the shortage remains an important factor limiting many small and medium-sized businesses from growing. This is further reinforced by what you'll see on the next page, which is CFIB's quarterly Help Wanted report, which looks at private sector job vacancies. And it has found that the national vacancy rate is at about 2.4%, which represents 300,000 private sector job openings that have been unfilled for the last 4 months because business owners have been unable to find suitable employees. In Atlantic Canada, the rate ranges from 2 to 2.5%. Construction, hospitality, and agriculture, each facing vacancy rates of around 3%. So immigration and programs like the Temporary Foreign Workers Program are important tools to help some small employers address these labor shortages. More than half, as you'll see on the next page, are looking to jobs that require on-the-job training, or that could be categorized as NOC level C or more likely NOC level D. Almost half are looking for those with NOC level C, which require occupation-specific training. A third are looking for college diploma apprenticeship training at NOC level B, and fewer than 10% are looking at NOC level A or people with university education. There are those who claim businesses are not doing enough to attract and retain Canadian workers. The next page will show you that that is not the case. Entrepreneurs are doing many things to attract and retain Canadian workers because they would much prefer to have a Canadian working than go through a lengthy and costly immigration process. And our slide shows how entrepreneurs are expanding their search for work. The next slide shows the types of positions being filled by TFWs. These jobs are being filled by TFWs because Canadian employers cannot find homegrown workers. And if you break out the data by sector, it will show that needs for different types of workers do vary significantly depending on the industry in question. The next slide, it's also important to note that almost 6 in 10 respondents said having access to temporary foreign workers allows them to keep their business open and keep the Canadian workers in those businesses employed. Another 48% believed it allowed them to expand. And on the following slide, I'd welcome you to take just a few moments, perhaps a little later, to look at some of the comments surrounding this from our members. The next chart is evidence of some of the difficulties in the system, and I don't think they'll be strange to you. The pinch points being timelines, paperwork, and government customer service, most of which is not found in the Immigration Department per se, but much of it in Service Canada. And beside the red tape and headaches are the costs. Before businesses can hire a foreign worker, they typically have to take a series of steps, including advertising, wage approval, return airfare, accommodation, recruiting fees, and the list goes on. 68% of business owners said the TFWs cost more than Canadian workers. but we are seeing some improvements. And as you'll see on the next page, we're pleased to see the 4-in, 4-out rule being eliminated. A small victory also in allowing businesses in the program prior to June 2014 to maintain a 20% cap on the proportion of lower wage GFWs that can be employed at one employer, and an exemption of the cap for seasonal industries until the end of 2017. And we are encouraged as well by announcements around the global skills strategy, including faster processing of permits. We're also very pleased to see the work being done on the Atlantic immigration pilot. And some of the key improvements I did want to point out here are the elimination of the need for the Labor Market Impact Assessment, or the LMIA. It has been a problem for our members, and it is a time and costly constraint. Also, less stringent advertising confirmation requirements, an important improvement, speed of processing, and we are very happy to see the addition of skill level C. Intermediate jobs are jobs usually needing high school or jobs on the job specific training. We do believe, however, that more consideration could be given or should be given to businesses' capacity to provide integration services for new Canadians as that demand is being made upon them. So we are watching this program carefully to examine uptake and its impact on the needs of those in the SME labor sector. These can be a vital lifeline for many entrepreneurs, and CFIB has been making recommendations along this line for some time, including our Introduction to Canada visa. We're supportive of our new express entry system that we have in this country. It allows employers to have a greater role in selecting immigrants. Unfortunately, a closer look at details reveals the new system will still not help employers looking to fill those entry-level jobs that are classified as lower-skilled positions. And we are suggesting that employers with staffing needs at all skill levels should be permitted participation in selecting workers through express entry. We've proposed a Bill of Rights for temporary foreign workers to include such things as better documentation of working conditions, employer-provided accommodation standards, and an internal dispute resolution process for employers and employees. We hope to learn from the Atlantic pilot project, and we hope some of the lessons that we do learn are applied to the immigration system more broadly. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to taking your questions later on.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. That was impressively efficient and informative. Ms. Juanita Ford, the floor is yours. 7 minutes, please.
Good afternoon. Mr. Chair and fellow committee members, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's committee meeting. It's my pleasure to present to you this afternoon. Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador is the tourism industry association for the province and represents tourism hospitality operators throughout the province in all sectors. As well, Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador represents its members on provincial and national tourism bodies such as Tourism HR Canada. The mandate of Hospitality NL includes the responsibility to support and development of professional workforce and improve the quality and market readiness of the tourism industry. In Newfoundland and Labrador, there are nearly 2,600 tourism businesses, primary, small, and medium-sized, that support the needs of a growing economy by providing the foundation of services and attractions in municipalities and other business need to grow, attract workers, and leverage private investment, thereby supporting sustainable and viable communities in Newfoundland and Labrador. The tourism industry is growing and is one of the most stable revenue-generating industries in the province, generating more than $1 billion in annual spending. Tourism offers renewable resource and accounts for 8% of all provincial jobs. Full-time, part-time, seasonal opportunities. Currently, the industry supports over 18,000 jobs in the province. Tourism, like other industries, are experiencing a labor shortage and increasingly stiff competition for workers. In today's service-oriented economies, it is small business that's providing the bulk of growth. The fact that approximately 80% of all tourism businesses in Newfoundland and Labrador are small, with fewer than 20 employees, it's indicative of the industry's appeal to entrepreneurs and to attract business opportunity to immigrants for cultural diversification and enrichment. Welcoming such diversification encourages immigrants to practice unique customs while still thriving as a citizen, resulting in increased immigration retention levels and community growth. The projected labor shortages in the tourism sector are caused by rising demand for labor during a period when Newfoundland and Labrador's labor force is expected to experience a sizable shift in its growth and composition. Traditionally, the tourism sector has relied heavily on young people as a source of labor. However, the rate at which young people are entering the labor force is decreasing, while competition to attract younger workers is intensifying from other sectors of the economy. The industry will experience a shortage of people in general to fill positions as much more pronounced deficiency in skilled workers to fill positions. In 2016, research conducted with the Tourism HR Canada and the Conference Board of Canada projected that by 2035, potential labour shortages in the tourism sector in Newfoundland and Labrador could reach 15.2%, leaving over 3,000 jobs unfilled. Current projections suggest the tourism sector could potentially support more jobs than workers will be available to fill. This means Newfoundland and Labrador will experience one of the most acute labour shortages in tourism in the province in Canada. We know that if nothing is done to increase the labour supply, the shortfall in revenues to the tourism sector in Canada by 2035 will be estimated $27.5 billion. The economic and social impact of these shortages of skilled labour will hamper growth, decrease investment in the sector, cause higher operating costs, reduce profits, erode the sector's ability to compete, and cause inferior customer service. The goal of Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador and the Canadian Tourism HR Canada is to hire Canadians first. We are working with partners to support and engage non-traditional labour pools to integrate them into the workforce. The focus will be on placing and providing programs to support young youth, Aboriginals, and people with disabilities to find work in the tourism industry. But based on the research, we know that these initiatives will not be enough and will have to look to immigration to fill these skill gaps. Immigrants will fill jobs that Canadians are not willing or able to fill. The importance of immigration to economic growth cannot be overstated and is as important to tourism as to any other industry, with almost a quarter of tourism workers being immigrants, including 40% of all chefs. The immigration pathways are too narrowly focused on NOC A, B, and O categories. Regardless of the totals, individuals with experience and skills in all categories are needed, perhaps even greater demand existing amongst those not currently well represented. Immigrants meeting unfilled job demands and possessing transferable skills, in other words, those outside of NOC A, B, and O categories, must be included amongst the recruitment mix for immigration programs. The future programming and policies must focus on jobs and demand, but current and projected needs over the next decade. Many occupations in tourism fall in NOC C and D categories and therefore considered unskilled. While many are low entry in terms of formal education requirements, the level of knowledge in the environment, safety, communication skills, etc. is quite demanding, and such low-skill jobs are essential to economic growth. For example, hotels require managers and marketing specialists, but cannot successfully operate without cleaners, servers, and maintenance workers. As advanced economies create highly skilled jobs, they also create a demand and need for more low-skilled jobs. Public policy should focus resources on continued public professional development opportunity, particularly education and training offered by professional associations who are able to respond to labor market demands, employment needs more readily. Efforts such as the immigration pilot under the Atlantic Growth Strategy can help change this. Tourism businesses in Newfoundland and Labrador have engaged in the pilot, and currently there are 48 businesses in the process of becoming designated employers, most of them in the food service sector. Enhanced programming for businesses to permanently hire foreign workers if they can't find Canadians to fill the job must be a priority. Enabling foreign-trained workers the right to access permanent residency is a good policy. This should be in addition to existing provincial nominee programs to meet labour market needs. Permanent residency will enable Canada to be more competitive in advancing qualification from other countries. Continued support for organizations that assist referees, immigrants, particularly on education, training, and employment services, is required as they strengthen links to organizations and businesses that can help Canadians enter the workforce. To grow our provincial population and achieve long-term social economic success, efforts are required to embrace initiatives and industries that contribute to the quality of life, offer family-friendly employment opportunities, and support in economic diversification. The growth throughout Newfoundland and Labrador and the rest of Atlantic Canada. The tourism industry offers such opportunities and benefits. Tourism offers gainful, flexible employment and entrepreneurship opportunities throughout all areas of Atlantic Canada and appealing to residents,
10 seconds, please.
Expatriates, and immigrants. On behalf of Hospitality Newfoundland and Labrador, I'd like to thank you for the Standing Committee for asking us here today.
Thank you, Ms. Ford. Mr. Navarro-Genie, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee. Excuse me? Good afternoon. I am grateful for the chance to appear before you on behalf of the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies this afternoon. Et merci de cette opportunité de comparaître devant vous.
Thank you for this opportunity to appear
about the declining population of Atlantic Canada. The region ages rapidly, adding to the pressures of economic decay. And without higher productivity, fewer people means a shrinking economy, greater fiscal burden, rising costs of certain economic scales. There is no significant population growth, but healthcare and education, for example, in costs keep rising and rising. Atlantic Canadians are proud of their cultural achievements and place a premium on them. But economy is often placed behind cultural concerns, and that will have to change for the sake of economy and culture alike. Theaters, parks, schools, hospitals, and festivals may all be important and more important than money, but we need wealth to sustain them, and we need wealth to maintain them. The same can be said for immigration. The Atlantic Institute for Market Studies favors and supports greater immigration. We need more people. But we are concerned that without correcting public policies that have set the region on its current path, and without removing obstacles to more vibrant economies, retaining immigrants will continue to be difficult. The question needs closer scrutiny, and it is currently under study at our institute. We know that the population challenge in the region is caused by a decline in natural growth and the outmigration of the native, largely young resident population. This young segment flees in search of economic opportunity that they do not find here. Hoping that the immigrant population will stay and solve our population challenges while the native residents continue to leave is no strategy for demographic renewal. Hemorrhage must be contained. People emigrate in search of prosperity for themselves and for their children. They often are willing to endure immediate sacrifice for the sake of future prosperity for their children. But unfortunately, future prosperity in Atlantic Canada is in question. And a significant portion of the demographic challenge is tied to economic stagnation. The region's economies are the most taxed jurisdictions in the country. We have labor laws that are often hostile to businesses and to investment. Energy is unnecessarily expensive. We prohibit economic activities such as hydraulic fracturing that are lawful elsewhere, while our children leave for employment in the very economic activities that we seem to want to ban here. Governments, with the exception of New Brunswick, have bloated public services that act as economic ballasts and impede economic effective change. We have, in addition, a paternalistic economic populism from political leaders that keeps spending monies we do not have and will not have, adding to the greater fiscal uncertainties. Someone told me not very long ago that Nova Scotians may be friendly but not welcoming. Maybe it is in this realization that we have sought to make immigrants feel more welcome. And this is as it should be. These are good developments. This alone will not increase immigrant retention. The point is the economy. The region needs to right its economic ship, a feat unto itself when we have a federal government determined to continue to spend more money than we have. Atlantic Canada needs a policy regime that encourages private economic growth, reduces government and its spending, eliminates the ample diet of subsidies we have here, becomes more competitive, reduces barriers to trade and commerce across provincial borders, and becomes the most desirable place to invest in the country. Tinkering at the edges, such as we are, to attract more people and investment will not do in an age in which we have to compete with the rest of the world. With immigration in mind, our recommendations are that the federal government encourage entrepreneurship and productivity in the region through the following policies. Slowly reduce equalization payments while gradually letting provinces keep all of the intake of the HST. This is achievable. Set a legislative framework to allow Atlantic provinces to create a small number of free economic zones within the region's boundaries. The federal government should also try to encourage Atlantic regional governments to join the New West Partnership. This is an idea that we have been trying to advance for quite a while. And we would like the federal government to encourage the Atlantic regional governments to abandon most forms of business subsidies in the region. If we need to attract more immigrants, and we do, we should also try to attract more American immigrants to Atlantic Canada. The situation simply is, at the moment, well, nearly perfect. With much economic and political uncertainty south of the border at present, it is time to explore the opportunity that highly skilled Americans want to move north under the right conditions. The federal government should assist by making the process of immigration as simple as possible. I will conclude by re-articulating the original point. Without a solid economic ground onto which we can welcome more of the badly needed immigrants in Atlantic Canada, current immigration policy will not be as successful. Without it, Atlantic Canada may continue to be simply an initial training ground to new Canadians and their revolving door entry into the country. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Navarro-Genie. Mr. Tabara, you have 7 minutes, and I understand you'll be splitting your time with Ms. Said?
No, with Elena.
No, with
sorry.
Ms. Lockhart?
You're right.
Oh, with Ms. Said. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question will be to Mr. Navarro-Genie. You mentioned about, just briefly now in your statement, about international students and American immigration. One thing I wanted to just point out is in my region, which is the Tri-Cities, is the high-tech sector in Canada is referred to, and they're continuously looking for international students to come to our area to learn at University of Waterloo, and then from there learning in engineering and various programs. Then they integrate well into the high-tech sector, and it boosts our economy and it flourishes our region. So my question is to you is, this has worked in our area, and it's helped us, and we've tried to reduce processing times for international students so that they can be more successful and they can come here a lot quicker, and even foreign workers as well. Can you give us an example of what you just mentioned right now with international students and how immigration would help in that region, and how I gave my example. How would that help in Atlantic provinces?
There is a very well-oiled machinery as a concerted effort from the universities in Atlantic Canada to attract more international students. The reference I made was that we must attract American immigrants. I wasn't precisely talking about students in that sense. And certainly we view American students as international students, of course, but they're not immigrants in that sense. My exhortation is that given the present conditions in American politics and a significant deal of anxiety among certain sectors of the population, we should not be shy to exploit those anxieties and try to see if we can generate more desire among Americans, especially among Americans who are highly qualified, to want to move up this way to Atlantic Canada.
Thank you. My second question is to Ms. Ford. Temporary foreign worker has been a tool in the tourism and hospitality industry to fill labor shortages. And by 2025, potential labor shortages in the tourism sector in Newfoundland and Labrador are projected to be in excess of 13.4% for the entire province. In your opinion, will the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Project be able to address these predicted shortages?
They will in some cases because you're letting in Class C, but there's still occupations in the D class for frontline food servers that won't be able to come in through the pilot. So those are the ones that are relying on the temporary foreign workers for the most part to relieve those pressures. So if we can't get more of those classes in, the temporary foreign program probably might not meet the needs that we need.
And then you're looking at other programs to help facilitate that gap, correct?
Yes, we are.
Okay. My next question is again to Mr. Navarro-Genie. You discussed immigration in Atlantic Canada on CTV a couple months back, stating that immigration to Atlantic Canada can help boost the economy. Can you elaborate on the needs and challenges faced by Nova Scotia in regards to immigration?
Yes. It's been a while since the word is out there that the decline in population here is causing shortages of labor for different reasons. There is a natural growth that is stagnant and now become negative in Nova Scotia, and then there is the issue of the flight from the province of skilled labor that has stopped or waned somewhat since the collapse of commodity prices out west, but continues to be a problem. And so there is need for labor. There is need for technical labor. There is need for manual labor. There is need for essentially more people to come to the province if we are to grow the economy. You can't grow an economy if you don't have people, unless you have improved productivity. And if you look at the productivity numbers in Atlantic Canada, they are among the worst in the country. And so it is necessary to bring more people to the province. My point about this is we should and try very hard to bring more people to the province, but we should also, in tandem, make sure that the people that we bring stay. We don't have a significant plan for retaining immigrants other than certain programs that will make them feel welcome, and that's all very good. But the ultimate point that I'm trying to drive is that the economy is the fundamental factor, drives people out of the province, native Atlantic Canadians, and unless we do something about that, immigrants we bring to the country who have virtually no emotional attachment to the land will also do the same.
Mr. Chair, how much time?
1.5 minutes.
So if you can just elaborate on that. We're talking about getting immigrants, wanting them to stay, and the economy is a big driver. Would you discuss also other factors that might want new immigrants to stay, or individuals that come to the Atlantic provinces? For example, you have great post-secondary institutions, which a lot of people flock to the Atlantic provinces for, but maybe in the arts, maybe in other sectors. What could still drive more people to stay in Atlantic provinces?
We have great universities, we have great culture, we have wonderful natural settings, all of which attract people. The issue is keeping them. And the only thing that is going to be able to keep them and that is going to generate the wealth that we need to be able to pay for the universities, that we need to be able to pay for the infrastructure that we have, is an expanding, consistent, sustainable economy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Will it be Mr. Tilson or Ms. Rempel?
It's Rempel.
Ms. Rempel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the witnesses, thank you for your presentations. All three of you, I think it's very important for us to consider, as was just mentioned, long-term economic growth in terms of the context of sustainable immigration. The issue around the TFW issue, I think, is one that's very pertinent and relevant. Frankly, I think that it's probably worthy of another study at some point in terms of reform, and certainly in terms of the tourism industry. That's one of the potential bright spots for long-term economic growth. The unfortunate thing with parliamentary committees, however, is that we have limited time to review certain issues, and there's been an issue that has arisen in the House of Commons very recently that I think actually begs our committee's attention. And with that, pursuing to Standing Order 1082, I move that the committee invite the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship to appear on the subject of the federal court ruling regarding citizenship revocation appeals to obtain information on whether or not the government intends to appeal the ruling and associated rationale, and that this meeting take place on an urgent basis given the 30-day time limit on appeals. So for my colleagues who are here today who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, on May the 10th, Justice Gagne issued a ruling that materially impacts some legislation that my understanding based on media reports will be before the House in a very short period of time, and that's Senate amendments to Bill C-6. So what's happened here is that the judge has made a ruling that would have substantive changes to our immigration system, the process. I'll actually note at this point in time that my colleague Jenny Kwan from the NDP moved an amendment at the House of Commons Committee when we were originally studying Bill C-6. The amendment was rejected, I believe. I'm not sure. Can't remember. And my understanding is that this is something that is going to be of material import. Now, my concern and my desire to have the minister appear in front of committee stems from the fact that a few weeks ago I asked in the House of Commons whether or not the government had intent to appeal the ruling, because if the government was going to appeal the ruling or not, either way, depending on how you feel about it, that would actually materially impact a few things. First of all, the committees and the House's deliberations on Bill C-6. If these amendments are to be read in the House of Commons before we rise for the summer, all of our parties and members will want to develop their positions on that particular issue. But if we don't have the minister here giving the rationale, or in the House, the response that I received in the House was wholly inadequate. It was, "Don't worry, we'll get back to you in due course." By my count, if this ruling was issued on May 10th and there's a 30-day appeals period, that time period would be up on June the 9th. And then after such time, we really only have a few days to debate Bill C-6. I'm not certain what the government's agenda is to get it through committee or not. But this is a confluence of information and activity that I feel parliamentarians need to have the minister before committee in an urgent basis in order to proceed with the appropriate amount of diligence on the bill. So in terms of the rationale one way or the other for the minister to actually appeal this ruling, and the reason why I believe he should come to committee, is that the amendment in Bill C-6 says the court hearing is given to people facing citizenship revocation on the ground of false representation or fraud. The immigration minister would be required to inform them of their right to appeal that decision in federal court, and the circumstances under which this amendment was introduced raised a lot of questions regarding whether the amendment was pushed by the PMO, though supposedly independent senators moved it. I think that that's something that's valid. That's a question I would like to ask the minister prior to debating this bill in the House, and certainly have the public and Canadians have a better understanding of prior to the minister announcing or letting the clock run out on the appeals process for this particular ruling. In the same vein, the federal court ruling argues that everyone has the right to appeal citizenship revocation, and in its 62-page ruling, Justice Gagné found the new provisions violate the Canadian Bills of Rights, which some have characterized as a quasi-constitutional document. The decision affects more than 200 individuals who have lost their Canadian citizenship since May 2015 under the shortened administrative process, and many will now be entitled to full hearings and may be able to get back their revoked citizenship. This decision addresses 8 test cases that challenge the constitutionality of the changes made in May 2015 over the alleged lies on their residency or citizenship application. The changes also barred them from reapplying for Canadian citizenship for 10 years after revocation. And again, the government has 30 days to appeal these rulings. So, I've asked the minister some questions in the House on this regard, but just to further convince my colleagues that this is something that we should do, there are several areas of unanswered questions that I believe that we should explain the minister should appear before committee to have to explain. So here is my rationale. First of all, I think about the existing backlogs. So there's an argument to be made, and I would like to know if the minister is going to appeal the ruling one way or the other around the issue of judicial backlogs. So an argument could be made that if the appeals process was not, or this ruling was not appealed and the ruling came into force, that there would be a further immediate burden on the court system. And unfortunately, this is a problem given where the government has been at in terms of appointment of judges. So if this federal court ruling is implemented and not appealed by the government, it could follow that the federal court system could face challenges in terms of resources. And this is because in the federal court ruling allowing for an appeals process, there could be an increase in appeals filed that the federal court system will hear. I would like to know from the minister how he feels this jives with the current process that's in place. Right now, the federal court will examine appeals if IRCC erred in interpretation and application of the IRPA, which is an act that, of course, governs our immigration processes in Canada. From the IRCC website, the current process surrounding citizenship revocation is as follows. The Strengthening Canadian Citizenship Act introduces new grounds for revocation of citizenship and provides for a streamlined revocation process. Previously, the citizenship revocation process generally involved three steps: the minister, the federal court, and the governor and council. Under the new revocation process, the governor general will no longer have a role except for some transitional cases. The new process has two decision-making streams. The vast majority of revocation cases will be decided by the minister. So the minister does, in fact, have judicial oversight, or not judicial oversight, but he does have discretion in these cases, and certain complex cases will be decided by the federal court. So I'd like to know from the minister whether or not he feels that the ruling essentially jives with his already existing ability and discretion to make decisions in these cases. I should note that the case management branch handles all cases considered for revocation of citizenship. Local staff are not involved in these types of cases other than to alert the case management branch should information come to their attention regarding a case that should be investigated for possible revocation. So as this makes clear, under the current process, some special cases are sent to the federal courts. The cases that currently go to the federal court are examined if IRCC erred in interpretation and application of the IRPA. I think that this is an important caveat as it ensures that the errors of the department do not lead to revocation, and it also maintains that people are not incentivized to lie on their application. So in terms of the minister's appearance before our committee, I'd ask my colleagues, again, to have him come here, because if he chooses not to appeal this ruling, these two elements could materially affect the process around which citizenship is revoked in cases of misrepresentation or fraud. I'll speak a little bit about why I think the minister needs to talk more, or certainly departmental officials as well, around the fact that people may or may not, under this ruling, be incentivized to provide fraudulent information on their applications. Just again, going through the IRCC website, something that I would like to see the minister talk to is that I think it's important to get a clearer picture of this actual process. When I read through the ruling, the process has been interpreted in certain ways. The testimony was quite interesting, but the website states that a person under revocation proceeding remains entitled to all the rights and privileges of Canadian citizenship until the person's citizenship is revoked. Under the new model, the date the person's citizenship is revoked is either the date of the minister's decision to revoke citizenship or the date of the declaration by the federal court. For transition cases that still require a decision from the governor and council, the person's citizenship is revoked on the date of the order in council. So, returning back to my point on the federal court ruling, which allows for an appeals process that is much broader in scope than the current mechanisms I've described, I would like to know how the minister plans to reconcile those two things should he decide not to appeal the ruling, and again, what impact that would have on the Senate amendment in Bill C-6. I think it's important to consider what we already know, that the courts are facing serious challenges in terms of existing backlogs in hearings. So again, going back, I'd be interested to know from the minister, should we decide to bring him here, if he has had any consultation with the justice minister specifically on the issue of backlog. Many people have said that the backlogs exist due to the fact that under this government there is a growing number of judicial vacancies, which have contributed to a large number of serious criminal cases being thrown out of court. If we do not hear from the minister at this committee as to whether or not he plans to appeal the federal court ruling, then we must also think about what this ruling will do to add to our existing backlog cases in light of the government's so far inability to fill judicial vacancies. As I've alluded to, this appeal would put extra strain on the courts, which are already strained by the judicial vacancies. And there have been so many. There have been so many articles and pieces that have been written on the impact of this. But again, the reason why I think it's just so important for the minister to come to committee, I'm going to draw from the words of Beverly McLaughlin. She wrote a piece last year, an article that said that there's an urgent need for judicial vacancies to be filled promptly. So the Supreme Court of Canada, Justice Beverly McLaughlin, linked the number of many empty seats on the federally appointed court benches across the country, and at the time of writing, 44 at the moment, to unacceptable trial delays, especially in criminal courts. So I would hope that at this point in time, the minister, again, going into our deliberations on the Senate amendments to Bill C-6, as well as the potential decision to appeal or not, would have reconciled the words of Justice McLaughlin with his action one way or the other. And I think that many of my colleagues here would like to know how that is going. I'm just looking. There are so many. I can't even believe this. There's just so many articles that have been written. I'm tempted to read them all to bolster my case. I might do that. We will see. Wow, there's just so many cases that have been thrown out because of judicial appeals. It's really a lot. So going through other rationale for this, I've talked to a few legal experts on the ruling, and I think that one of the concerns that many of us share is that if this ruling is first of all, going back to the basis of this ruling, I think that there's a legitimate argument that could be made that perhaps errs or contradicts Justice Gagne's ruling that citizenship that was obtained through fraud, the provisions that she alluded to in terms of rights for citizenship don't apply, as that person was never entitled to citizenship in the first place. So there's been many cases throughout the history of Canada where we've seen massive citizenship fraud, and I believe that that's actually the rationale for why these changes were put in place to begin with. I'm just looking for the actual numbers of. Here we go. Here.
So Ms. Rempel, while you're checking your notes, if you allow me a small indulgence, I'd like to thank our witnesses for appearing today. I know that Ms. Ford has a flight to catch.
Here we are.
And thank you for your statements, your opening statements. They were very informative, and they'll help to inform our study. So you're free to leave. Thank you so much. And and the video conference witnesses as well. With that, I return the floor to Ms. Rempel.
So in terms of the rationale for appealing this ruling, again, I'd like to hear the minister's rationale one way or the other, given that I know that the Senate had a very robust debate on whether or not this amendment should be put forward. Ms. Kwan has raised it here. I'm of the opinion that perhaps it shouldn't happen, but the article that I'm going to refer to was posted on September 10th, 2012 on CBC, and the article is entitled 3,100 Citizenships Ordered Revoked for Immigration Fraud. The federal government has started the process of revoking the citizenship. Oh, and I should say, Mr. Chair, I didn't actually ask for the witnesses to leave. I mean, if you had asked me to, cede the floor to them, I perhaps would have done that. But I will note that you did ask them to leave. So with that, I will take up perhaps a little bit more time. So the federal government has started the process of revoking the citizenship of 3,100 people suspected of lying to become Canadians. Speaking at a news conference on Ottawa Monday, then Immigration Minister, my good friend Jason Kenney, said that the federal government is applying the full strength of Canadian law to crack down on individuals suspected of obtaining citizenship fraudulently or falsifying information required for permanent residency. Canadian citizenship is not for sale, Kenney told reporters. We are taking action to strip citizenship and permanent resident status from people who don't play by the rules and who lie or cheat to become a Canadian citizen. Other quotes from this article include, the crackdown on fraudulent citizenship is part of an investigation to some 11,000 people who may be lying to apply for citizenship or maintain permanent resident status. And of these, nearly 5,000 people with permanent resident status have been flagged for additional scrutiny should they attempt to enter Canada or obtain citizenship, a departmental release said on Monday. So, fraudulent applications and misrepresentations are not an anomaly in Canada. And my worry is that if the government does not appeal this ruling, there will be an incentive for this trend to continue. So I'd like the minister to come to committee to discuss whether or not he's considered that and what steps he would put in place to ensure that this doesn't continue to happen should the government decide not to appeal the ruling. My sense is that it's going to be very difficult for the government to deal with that particular trend should they not appeal this ruling. There's another article that came out in 2014, the article titled "Blatant Lying Loses Family Its Citizenship, but Earns Them a $63,000 bill from the Canadian government." And it was details about a family that was stripped of their Canadian citizenship after they were caught blatantly lying about living in Canada. In this case, and I'm quoting from the article, the family, a father, a mother, and their two daughters signed citizenship forms claiming that they lived in Canada for almost all of the previous 4 years when they really lived in the United Arab Emirates, a fact posted online in the daughters' public resumes on LinkedIn. So there's a body of evidence that our former government used to make changes to this process, and it shows that instances of lying to gain citizenship is not a rarity. Now, here's the real kicker. The minister has not yet, part of the reason why the minister needs to come to committee is that he has not yet addressed the findings of the Auditor General's report in 2016. For those of you who aren't familiar, what I'm concerned about is that the minister, if he doesn't appear before committee before he makes this decision around whether or not to appeal the ruling, he actually also has not publicly addressed many of the findings in the Auditor General's report in 2016 around fraud. So I will highlight what some of those were. And this is from a Globe and Mail article published on Tuesday, May the 3rd. Canada's Immigration Department did not properly detect and prevent citizenship fraud, resulting in the review of about 700 cases as of January, according to Auditor General Michael Ferguson's spring report. The report, tabled in the House of Commons on Tuesday, found a number of concerns in the citizenship program affecting the department's ability to prevent fraud, including the absence of a method to identify and document fraud risks. We concluded that Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada's efforts to detect and prevent citizenship fraud were not adequate, Mr. Ferguson said at a news conference on Tuesday. These gaps make it, difficult for Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada to assess the impacts of its efforts to combat citizenship fraud. According to the report, which covered the period between July 2014 and October 2015, the most common reasons for revoking citizenship are residency and identity fraud and undeclared criminal proceedings. The report found that citizenship officers did not consistently apply the department's methods to identify and prevent fraud when dealing with suspicious immigration documents, such as altered passports. For example, in one region, citizenship officers have not seized any suspicious documents for in-depth analysis since at least 2010. It was also found that citizenship officers did not have the information they needed to properly identify problem addresses when making decisions to grant citizenship. Problem addresses are those known or suspected to be associated with fraud and used by citizenship applicants to meet residency requirements. Mr. Ferguson cited an example where one address was not identified as a problem, even though it was used by 50 applicants. 7 of whom were granted Canadian citizenship. He said the fact that it was so simple for his office to find that example is concerning. The steps that we took to try to identify cases of citizenship fraud were not complicated. We're not talking here about indications necessarily of sophisticated fraud. It was so fairly simple for us to find these 50 cases, and I fundamentally think that it means 50 cases too many, Mr. Ferguson told Reporter. At the time, my NDP colleague, David Christopherson, questioned how the government missed 50 cases. It strikes the common sense chord in people, Mr. Christopherson said. I think that the average Canadian would think that the technology we have these days, you have nothing in place at all that raises a red flag with that. And the problem was further complicated by poor information sharing with the RCMP, which provides information about criminal behavior among permanent residents, and the border CBSA, which leads to investigation of citizenship fraud. Now, usually once a scathing report like this comes out, the minister would issue a response. I did look for that, and on the Government of Canada's news webpage, you can find the following quote from the former minister, Minister McCallum, in response to the Auditor General's reports. He said, "We have thoroughly reviewed all cases flagged by the Office of the Auditor General to determine if citizenship fraud may have occurred. As a result, we've opened investigation towards possible citizenship revocation from about a dozen individuals. IRCC has a number of different ways of detecting and preventing fraud, in addition to those the Auditor General focused upon. As well, we are continuously looking for ways to improve fraud detection and prevention processes in all of our programs." So this is, I think, this is about a year ago now that this has come out, and actually over a year ago. And so now we're faced with this staring down the barrel of this ruling that has come out from the federal court and a very, very short ticking clock on whether or not the government is going to appeal it. The problem is, this is the last that I think we've heard from an immigration minister on addressing those fundamental challenges that were identified in the Auditor General's report. So if we are going to not appeal this ruling and allow this appeals process to happen, essentially, my concern is that the government has really not done anything to address these instances, the prevention of fraud. So we risk incenting people to lie on their applications, as they would have a drawn-out appeals process to go through. But we've also done nothing to prevent or ensure that we're detecting cases of fraud on the front end. And to me, like the fact that the minister has not answered any questions to this regard and is about to make a decision that's not only pertinent to several levels of government process, but also to a bill that the government has signaled, or amendments to a bill that the government has signaled that they are going to be debating in the House of Commons, I actually think it's an abdication of responsibility. The fact that we're even here whatsoever and that we're still getting pat answers from the House of Commons from the minister or his parliamentary secretary, I think I'm not sure what that is. The last thing that I think parliamentarians want to hear, Mr. Chair, is the minister either A, just letting the time pass and not making any remarks about it, or B, just sort of at some point announcing a press conference down the road that, oh, hey, we went one way or the other. We want to know why, and especially in light of these findings, how the government is going to address it should they choose to allow the ruling to stand. So I think it makes clear that even the former minister was willing to admit that fraudulent applications were a problem, and they continue to be a real threat to the system if proper mechanisms are not in place to stop these incidences. And I'd really like to know from the minister what he's done to address this prior to making my decision on whether or not to oppose the government's decision to appeal or not appeal one way, or certainly before I take a position in the House of Commons on the amendments to Bill C-6. I've given you plenty of evidence to indicate that fraudulent applications and misrepresentations on documents is a real problem that exists in Canada. Now, my Liberal colleagues may now be wondering, why would this federal court ruling need on the need for an appeals process incentivize lying on one's application? So I've made a fairly strong claim there, and I'd like to walk them through some of the logic for that. And I'd certainly like to have the minister come back to committee so that we can ask him how he feels about some of these assumptions. So if you think of it this way, if you know that your application as a newcomer to Canada was more likely to be accepted if certain elements of your personal story were negated, exaggerated, or are falsified, and if you knew that even if the government figured this out after you were granted citizenship, that there was still an appeals process to make your place, would this appeal option not provide you with some sort of incentive to make the faulty claim? I think that we all know the answer to this question, and while we want to believe that everyone seeking to Canada is doing it through legitimate and legal means, we must ensure that there are mechanisms in place in order to deter actions that could undermine the integrity of our immigration system. So I do think that there is enough evidence to suggest that the federal court ruling will to some extent incentivize lying on one's application, and this is a serious issue that the committee must consider prior to looking to the amendments at Bill C6, on Bill C6. But also looking at our duties in terms of, I don't believe that anyone in this room here has a government appointment, so all of our responsibility, regardless of partisan stripe, to hold the government to account. Just further on this point, I think when you talk about the incentivization to lie, my colleague, Ms. Kwan, highlighted, I think, some very good points when we were debating the original Bill C6. We heard testimony about people who had been either told by immigration consultants to lie on their application, or I believe that was the testimony. But there were some people who were saying, look, we might need an appeals process. If somebody, was convicted of a crime, as an example, in a country where they felt that the system was corrupt or there was some sort of corruption involved in their ruling, that they would have no recourse. I'd like to hear from the minister directly on that particular assertion. My experience has been as a member of parliament that if people who have come to my office in situations like this where they've said, okay, well, we had an unjust court ruling, it's difficult for us as members of parliament to help them because they lied on their application to begin with, right? So we often say, it's very difficult for us, and we encourage people to be truthful. I think that what I would like to see the minister's opinion on is how the government plans to incent people to be truthful, because we know that when people are truthful, let's say that person who, that situation that I just outlined had actually hadn't omitted the detail of a conviction, but had put what the extenuating circumstances were on their original application. We know that our process looks at extenuating circumstances, and while there's no guarantee that somebody is going to be granted citizenship, the point that we want to make is to be truthful, to play by the rules. I am very worried that the minister has not spoken yet on what this ruling could mean. And the minister did at committee, and I believe it was at the Senate, say that he was going to entertain this amendment. And now, in light of this ruling, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. So I would like to talk a bit more about something else I'd like to hear from the minister from. I'd like to continue on the Auditor General gaps that were found. I think that this does provide further justification to revoke citizenship from fraudulent applicants and to deter lying. I'd like to know, if the minister welcomed the finding of the Government Auditor General, who highlighted serious gaps in the government's ability to enforce the existing citizenship requirements that are needed to keep Canadians safe and uphold the integrity and value of Canadian citizenship. I would like to know what the minister has done in terms of working with his colleague, the Minister of Public Safety, to deal with the particular recommendation around the lack of information sharing between the RCMP and CBSA with IRCC, especially since comprehensive memorandum of understanding currently exists to facilitate information sharing. So, it would be one thing if the minister came to committee and said, well, we already have the legislative mechanisms in place, or we need to fix the legislative mechanisms, but we know that there are memoranda of understanding in place to do that. It's just the process isn't working. So this gap is concerning, but it's also something that we must discuss with the minister if he gives insight that committee was not planning on, insight that the government is not planning on appealing the federal court ruling. And again, this is just one of the many reasons that I'm asking the minister to appear before committee. So in terms of the updates that were made to the Citizenship Act by our former government, it actually had not been updated for over 37 years, which is my ripe old age. We feel that, and I feel that it strengthened the value of Canadian citizenship by providing a balanced set of reforms that demonstrated respect for rights, duties, privileges, and responsibilities of Canadian citizenship. However, without an appeal to the federal courts on this ruling, the safeguards in place to deter fraudulent applications could be weakened. There's further commentary on some of the gaps that have been identified by the Auditor General that I believe that the minister should discuss in front of committee prior to making this decision. People with serious criminal records and other using potentially phony addresses are among those who managed to secure Canadian citizenship thanks to a system that doesn't do enough to root out fraud, the Auditor General has found. So again, this audit between July 2014 and last fall, so this was 2016, found that the Immigration Department has granted citizenship based on incomplete information or with all the necessary checks because it's not applying its own methods to combat fraud. The issue isn't the department's alone. So again, this is where, I'd want to know if the minister has talked to his colleague in public safety. The Auditor General found that they weren't getting timely or enough information from border officials or the RCMP either to help flag suspect cases. This finding matters because ineligible individuals may obtain citizenship and receive the benefits to which they are not entitled, Ferguson wrote in his spring report tabled Tuesday in the House of Commons. Revoking citizenship that should not have been granted takes significant time and money. The problems range from immigration officials not routinely checking travel documents against a database of known fake papers to a failure by officers or their computers to flag problematic addresses that could point to residency fraud. In one instance, it took 7 years for officials to catch on to a fact that a single address had been used by 50 different applicants over different time periods. So going on to this, there was an order paper question that was submitted by my colleague from Central Okanagan, Similkameen, Nicola. The order paper question came back on December 17th, 2016. The response to this order paper question is something I think the minister should respond to in the light of this decision that he's about to make. This response particularly concerns me as it details how the department does not maintain centralized data on all cases where fraud have been detected. Without this information, I think that it's vital for the minister to appear before us and answer whether or not he is appealing the federal court decision. We need to know this because if the minister indicates that the government is not appealing the federal court ruling, then we need to know what the government's plan is to deal not only with these gaps, but also with the fact that data on fraud is not even being tracked. So again, going to the order paper question. So the question that was asked was, there were several questions that were asked. The first one was, how many cases of citizenship fraud have been uncovered? The department, and this is the response, so this is quite shocking, the department does not maintain centralized data on all cases where fraud have been detected, nor can it generate this information from existing systems. So should the government allow this ruling to stand and not appeal it, and I think there are grounds to appeal it, how is the minister possibly going to reconcile that ruling with that particular statement? That's a great question for him that he could answer here at committee. Fraud might be detected in the initial citizenship application or at any point after citizenship has been granted, and may be raised by citizenship officers, by other staff in the context of related applications, or by partners as part of large-scale investigations, for example. When a citizenship officer discovers that an applicant has misrepresented material facts in their applications, they may refuse the applicant for misrepresentation, and the individual is barred from reapplying for citizenship for 5 years. Since this new authority was introduced in the Citizenship Act in May 2015, at least 100 individuals have been refused on this ground. Where citizenship officers uncover fraud that may be part of a larger organized fraud activity, the information may be conveyed to enforcement partners for further action. In these cases, when the enforcement partners, RCMP and CBSA, take on the investigation, IRCC will assist them and carry out activities. So this is important, especially in light of the testimony that we've just heard on immigration consultants. So, while it's that particular study is slightly out of scope, the congruency here is that there are complexities and silos and sort of a lack of accountability across what is deemed here as enforcement partners, not only on detecting and dealing with cases of immigration consultant fraud, but also fraud on citizenship applications. So again, if my worry is that the minister is just going to let this deadline pass and not say anything about it, and then not speak to the fact that there's a fundamental problem with how these cases are tracked and how that interaction between enforcement partners actually functions. And if we as parliamentarians don't hold the minister to account for that, we may see significant and additional serious cases of fraud if we're not sort of pushing or putting the minister's feet to the fire to ensure that those processes are put in place prior to this sort of going out with a whimper. The next question that was asked on this order paper question was, which country of origin had the highest level of citizenship fraud? Now, this is a very interesting question in terms of policy. I'm going to get to that, but per the answer A, this is the response from the department. Per answer A, the department does not maintain centralized data to capture and report on citizenship fraud by country of origin. Okay, so the minister needs to come here, because when you think about that, everything that we just heard in the immigration consultant study, and certainly processes that would have to be put in place to deter people from lying on their applications to begin with, we should be targeting our resources on countries where we see high instances of immigration fraud. We should be going to those countries, working through diplomatic channels, through our embassies, through officials that are on the ground there, to put together awareness plans to make sure that it's either not happening through immigration consultants, bad advice, or that we could figure out what's actually going on to see why we're seeing a spike or not from different countries. The fact that the department doesn't maintain centralized data to capture and report on citizenship fraud by country of origin, and we're staring down the barrel of this ruling, that doesn't bode well. And I think that the minister should come to committee to discuss what his plans are for that. The next question was, what type of fraud is most common? So it says the most common type of fraud is residence fraud, where individual falsified or simulated their residence in Canada during the relevant period, often through the use of consultant purposes. Okay, so if the minister is not going to appeal the ruling, or if he is, there is a direct intersection between the recommendations that we would be looking at with the immigration consultant study, but more importantly, the Bill C-6 coming back to the House, the bill actually shortens the residency requirement in Canada. So the fact that IRCC has flagged that residence fraud is probably one of the most common types of fraud, I think that we're actually, when you think about the math on that, Bill C-6, when passed by the Liberal majority, is going to shorten the residency requirement. We know from this order paper question that residence fraud is one of the largest instances of fraud, and then the ruling is going to allow for an appeals process. That is a confluence that one could logically assume would allow and incentivize people to lie on their citizenship application. So the minister, I implore you, should come to committee to answer questions around how they are going to deal with that problem should they choose not to appeal the ruling. So then my colleague, Mr. Albus, asked how many of these cases have resulted in a deportation order. And the department did talk about the process there. But again, what was interesting on me, on reading this process is the fact that I don't think that there's a lot of information in the Canadian public, or certainly in the international community, on the process, what happens should you lie on your citizenship application. And I'd like the minister to explain what efforts he's made or plans to make in light of these rulings to strengthen the international community's understanding of that particular process. So I think it's very clear there are gaps in our system that were previously identified by the Auditor General, and that's why it's so important for the minister to appear before our committee to testify on whether or not they will be appealing the federal court ruling. If we don't have this information, it will be difficult for us as policymakers to adequately assess Bill C-6 in accordance with these gaps previously identified and determine whether the integrity of our citizenship process is being upheld. So the other thing that I would really like to get the minister's opinion on is whether or not his department officials or any of the government lawyers that have been advising on this, how they interpret what is part of the core of the ruling on the notion that citizenship is a right in this case. And I think anybody listening to this today would be very interested. So I think that, how I read this and how certain people read Justice Gagne's ruling is that it's predicated upon this notion that citizenship is a right. My former colleague, Minister Chris Alexander, said citizenship is not a right, it's a privilege. Now, just to expound upon that. I would argue, and I would love to see if the minister's lawyers have advised him on the same, that if you've obtained your citizenship through fraudulent means, that it is not a right because you did not obtain it properly to begin with. So there have been some quotes from stakeholder groups to this effect. This was in May 2014. A spokesperson for Immigrants for Canada said about citizenship, Immigrants for Canada holds that citizenship in Canada is a privilege. To that end, we believe it should be, above all, available to all, but provided to those who have earned it. And so I think that at the core of this ruling, we've actually changed what earned it means. And I'd really like to know if the minister agrees one way or the other with that particular notion, because it fundamentally changes our understanding of the value of Canadian citizenship. This same spokesperson, Mr. Paul Adia, said, I believe it was at this meeting, with respect to revocation, in principle and based on our organization's view that citizenship is a privilege, we strongly support the notion of revocation for citizenship, and he goes on, for the obtainment of citizenship via fraud. So this ruling, I think, has an impact on that. He also said, we at Immigrants for Canada view citizenship like being a member of a team. Everybody has the opportunity and the chance to try out for that team, but you have to meet certain requirements. And I would think, Mr. Chair, I would like to know if the minister agrees with that statement or not. I know that, we've had very heated arguments on both sides of the issue on whether or not citizenship should be revoked in the instances of convictions of terrorism, but I thought that there was near unanimity that citizenship should be revoked in cases where there's clear instances of fraud. And my concern is that we will incent people to mislead or put misleading information on their application, and it could be at the advice of immigration consultants who are not scrupulous. That is not true. And I think that that actually devalues Canadian citizenship. So I would like, I've given many of my own quotes here, but I'd like to try and persuade my Liberal colleagues with some of the words of their own ministers. So in a Hill Times article from October 20th, 2016, titled, McCallum doesn't want to let fraudsters off the hook, though through moratorium on citizenship revocation. The former minister makes it clear that fraudulent applications are not entitled to citizenship. Here's an important section from that article that I would like to bring you to your attention. In a written statement provided to the Hill Times, I'm just going to take a glass of water, I'm a little parched. Mr. McCallum's office said that the recent increase in citizenship revocations is the result of large-scale fraud investigations led by our RCMP and CBSA partners that began under the former Conservative government. These investigations led to criminal convictions of several immigration consultants, and notices of intent to revoke citizenship were sent to their clients who had provided fraudulent documents to suggest that they were living in Canada when they were living abroad in order to gain citizenship. Others changed their identity in order to hide backgrounds. And here's the close. Here's the big finale to my Liberal colleagues. These applicants were never entitled to Canadian citizenship. And that is the words of our former Immigration Minister, John McCallum. Mr. McCallum and I had a boisterous and good relationship. I had the honor of giving him a goodbye speech in the House of Commons. It was actually one of the highlights of my parliamentary career. I only hope that I get one as boisterous as that, when I'm sure many people in this room would love to do that at some point. But I would like to say that for John McCallum to say that these applicants were never entitled to Canadian citizenship, I would like to know if the current immigration minister sees things the same way. Because if John McCallum can get up and say that citizens who have their, or people who have their citizenship revoked due to fraud, he is saying that the fundamental core of this ruling, which is that people are entitled to the citizenship, ergo they're entitled to a long drawn out appeals process, there's a dichotomy there. And I would hope that, Minister McCallum's understanding of this principle has spread to our new minister, and that in that, department officials, lawyers from the Government of Canada are giving him the advice to take the spirit of that statement from Minister McCallum and apply it and appeal this ruling. There's been many articles. Again, I want to go back to the argument and flesh it out a little bit more. Should the government allow the appeals or decide not to appeal this ruling based on the statement that we need to have some drawn-out appeals process, the appeals process isn't working? I would like to get the minister's feedback on how he feels that the current system of appeals is working. So I'm going to use Minister Hussain, the current minister's own words from Senate committee. This is at the Senate committee on March the 1st, 2016. This is what he said in direct query around the question. I think there was a line of questioning leading up to the amendment that we now see in the amended Bill C-6. He said, in fact, the whole point of sending the revocation notice to the affected party is to allow the party to gather information and provide any personal circumstances to the decision maker so that the decision maker takes those personal circumstances into consideration, which would include humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So he's already commented on the efficacy of the current process. If he chooses not to appeal this ruling, why, given that statement at the Senate committee? When asked about whether the person has the right to counsel, Minister Hussain noted, absolute right to counsel. The written submissions and the case, you're allowed to use counsel. There's no prohibition to having counsel. Further, he stated, you have a right to a judicial review with leave. So if the current minister believes that the process is adequate, number one, we need to know if he is deciding not to appeal the ruling, why, because that's a significant departure from what he testified at Senate committee. And we need to receive clarification on his intentions with the federal court appeal before voting on C-6. It might be helpful to explain or have him explain what procedural fairness safeguards exist right now in the current process. And from the same committee meeting that Minister Hussain said this, Ms. Hubert, Director of the Citizenship Program Delivery at IRCC, said the following. First, one decision in the department initially investigates cases to see if there is sufficient evidence that may warrant consideration of revocation. First one division in the department initially investigates cases to see if there is sufficient evidence that may warrant consideration of revocation. Where there is belief that there is sufficient evidence, the file then gets transferred to a different division that will then make the decision on whether to proceed with a notice of intent to revoke. The notice of intent provides all the evidence upon which the decision maker could be relying at that point in time to make their decision and invites individuals to submit all factors related to that which they should take into account when making the decision, including personal circumstances such as the length of their time in Canada, the age at which they were required citizenship, their ties to Canada, and those sorts of things. At that point, when that material comes in, the decision maker will decide whether to proceed with the decision. So essentially what is being presented here is that the department believes that the system as it is adequate. So if the government is still of that opinion and then decides not to appeal this ruling, we need to know why in order for, first of all, I think to develop and advocate for a program to discourage people from lying on their citizenship application, but also, frankly, I'm a member of the opposition to oppose that decision. Because we've been, based on this testimony, led to believe so far that everything is great. Well, clearly not, according to the Auditor General, but that we have a good system to base things on. So, it's been brought to my attention that, this could, if the minister doesn't appear, given the timing and this committee, one could make a case around contempt for Parliament. While this information sounds a bit like a brief of privilege, Without this information, it could be interpreted as a breach of privilege, which in the House of Commons Procedure and Practice Manual is defined as any disregard or attack on the rights, powers, and immunities of the House and its members, either by an outside person or body, or by a member of the House, is referred to as a breach of privilege and is punishable by the House. There are, however, other affronts in the dignity and authority of Parliament which may or may not fall within one of the specifically defined privileges. Thus, the House also claims the right to punish as a contempt any action which, though not a breach of specific privilege, tends to obstruct or impede the House in its performance or in its functions, obstructs or impedes any member or officer of the House in the discharge of their duties, or is an offense against the authority or dignity of the House, such as disobedience of its legitimate commands or libels upon itself, its members, or its officers. The rationale of the power to punish contempts, whether contempt of court or contempt of the Houses, is that the courts and the two houses should be able to protect themselves from acts which, quote, and underlined, directly or indirectly impede them from the performance of their functions. And I think, Mr. Chair, to all of us here, given the gravity of this ruling, the impact that I've laid out to date on the huge potential impact that this ruling could have on our immigration system, the Senate amendment to Bill C-6 that we are going to be tasked with reviewing, and the fact that we have not received any information from the Minister on the Auditor General finding or whether or not they are going to appeal this ruling or that rationale, one could make an argument around that particular point in the standing orders. So, and just to further validate that, and using this as rationale for my Liberal colleagues to perhaps support this motion, actions which can amount to a contempt of Parliament vary, but typically include things such as deliberately misleading or lying to a House or Parliamentary committee, refusing to testify before. So that's another thing. I mean, why hasn't the Minister come and talked about this to date? Or produce documents to a House or committee, or attempting to influence a member either by bribery or threats. There hasn't been any of those. Fair enough. The penalties for contempt of Parliament can include jail time, and in the case of a minority Parliament, usually result in a vote of non-confidence. Moreover, as stated in a National Post article from February 2010, at least 236 people have been served notice of Canadian citizenship revocation since the Liberals came into federal office, a dramatic increase over previous years that is the result of a Harper-era legislation, according to Canada's Immigration Department. Decisions are, quote, more efficient and timely since the Conservative government's new laws took effect, according to spokesperson Nancy Caron. The way the system now works, after receiving revocation notices, people have 60 days to respond by providing submissions or any additional information to immigration, including details of their personal circumstances or ties to Canada. Former Immigration Minister John McCallum told senators in October he would certainly welcome the amendment, quote. So again, there's like this discrepancy between what McCallum's saying on one thing and then on another day, what Hussein's saying, what this ruling is. Like, there's a lot of confusion on where the Liberal ministers have been on this particular issue. But he said that he would certainly welcome the amendment, this is the amendment to Bill C-6, and told the Commons that he believed that people should have a right to proper appeal. Somebody named Bernie Darrible, Director of Communications for Immigration Minister Hussein, said it would not be appropriate for the minister to comment while the Senate deliberates. That's odd. That's quite strange, but nonetheless. More than half of Canadians, 53%, would have rather kept Bill C-24 as is, according to a new Angus Reid poll from March 2016, which questioned 1,492 people. Explaining increases in citizenship revocation, Caron said that immigration workers have been prioritizing, quote, the most serious cases, such as those involving serious criminality or organized fraud. Examples include assuming fraudulent identity, producing doctored documents to conceal criminality, or falsifying residence records. And since November 2015, 14 people have had citizenship revoked for hiding crimes they committed while they were permanent residents of Canada, and another 5 had citizenships revoked for hiding crimes committed before they immigrated. In the former case, if their citizenship is revoked, people revert back to being foreign nationals, while in the latter case, people revert back to being permanent residents. And revocation doesn't necessarily result in a permanent deportation order. Look, there are many things that we need to question the minister of under this section. The point that I'm trying to make when using the issue of privilege or contempt is that as parliamentarians, we do have the right to hear from the minister. Well, and should he choose not to appear before this committee or colleagues not vote to have him here, it's very difficult for us to do our jobs, especially on matters of such great import, such as this particular ruling. I will speak to one more issue that has come up. It's sort of a bit of a hot topic in legal circles right now as it pertains to Justice Gagne's ruling. And that's a chunk of the ruling is predicated upon an interpretation of the Bill of Rights. This is something that I'd like to hear from the minister and potentially any advice that he's received from government lawyers. The federal court ruling on appeals process for citizenship revocation cited that the current legislation is in violation of the Bill of Rights. Obviously, the Bill of Rights is an important document.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ms. Rappel is giving some very important points on this issue about the minister appearing on these matters. And with due respect to you, I think you should be giving her your full attention. I realize that members want to meet with you privately, but I would suggest that your responsibility is to listen to what she has to say. It would be very helpful if you would do that.
Thank you, and I understand that was a message that you had wished delivered to me, but the point
Mr.
taken.
Chairman, that wasn't a message I wished delivered to you. I'm saying it in open committee. It's a point of order. And I believe that the chair of any committee should pay attention to the speaker of who's speaking at that particular time.
And I was paying attention.
Well, with due respect, sir, you were not. You were talking to another member of the committee in private. And I believe that you should be listening to what the current speaker is saying.
It certainly isn't a private committee room, but I think Ms. Rempel would like to continue.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for listening to a lengthy argument, but one that I think is very important, and thank you for your leadership on our committee today. So going back to the question of the Bill of Rights and its interpretation in terms of this ruling and the need for the minister to explain what advice he's been given, I'll just back up. The Bill of Rights was created by Prime Minister John Diefenbaker in 1960, years before the Charter of Rights and Freedom. It's important to note that the Bill of Rights has, quote, quasi-constitutional status, differing from that of constitutional status. The Osgood Hall Law Journal published a piece in 2016 by Vanessa MacDonald titled A Theory of Quasi-Constitutional Legislation. And to share with you some excerpts from this piece in terms of what I think the minister needs to present to committee and to parliamentarians in terms of his decision to appeal or not the ruling, these experts should demonstrate just one reason why I believe it's in the interest of the government to consider an appeals process which might influence the minister's decision-making. And so here's the excerpt. Since the 1970s, the Supreme Court of Canada has treated a small number of statutes as quasi-constitutional. These statutes, which the court has described as not quite constitutional, but certainly more than ordinary, include human rights acts, privacy and official languages legislation, and statutory bills of rights such as the Canadian Bills of Rights and the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. Although quasi-constitutional statutes are enacted in the same way as other laws, they are interpreted in the broad and generous manner usually reserved for constitutional rights. They also trump later conflicting ordinary laws unless those laws provide otherwise. This trumping rule has always had significant consequences for laws that fall short of the guarantees found in quasi-constitutional statutes. Despite the long-standing presence of these statutes in Canadian law, however, the court has yet to articulate comprehensive criteria for recognizing a statute or regulation as quasi-constitutional. Some quasi-constitutional statutes contain supremacy laws maintaining the application of the trumping rule described above and signaling to courts that Parliament intended the law to be treated as quasi-constitutional. Just as often, however, the court's decision to treat a statute as quasi-constitutional flows from the close relationship between these statutes and constitutional right. much more work remains to be done to develop a theory of quasi-constitutional statutes in Canada. So from this excerpt, I hope that I've given my colleagues something to think about. I also think that it's important the minister appears before committee so that we can have these important decisions about the federal court, discussions about the federal court ruling, and whether or not they are planning to appeal it. This is especially important as we draw closer to the date in which the appeal process can be filed.
Mr. Chair, on a point of order, please, if I may. Thank you very much. As my colleagues giving a lengthy opinion about the motion, my name was mentioned a couple of times in her speech, and I just want to make sure that my privilege it has not been violated. So I want to clarify on the record with reference to where my name was mentioned on the points that were made. And on the first point, the issue was raised around an amendment. Amendment was moved with respect to Bill C-6. And those were amendments to ensure that there would be due process for people whose citizenship would be revoked because of misrepresentation or fraud. And I feel very strongly about that people should have the right to due process and to appeal that process. And Bill C-6 was restoring that process, and my amendment to Bill C-6 was to restore that process, to which I fully support. However, my amendment was ruled was not supported and was ruled out of order. And so I just want to state clearly in reference to that and what my position is, which is to absolutely support a process for appeal that takes into consideration of humanitarian compassionate reasons and extenuating circumstances. As I understand it through the Senate, there is an amendment to Bill C-6 which brings back a iteration of due process embedded in that. When and if that comes before the House of Commons, if the government decides to bring that forward, to be clear, that's something I do support. So that's my view on that. And on the second point, and again, I just want to clarify to make sure that my privilege has not been violated, and that is on the point about my view on appeals with respect to bad actors, and that is in the consulting industry. Absolutely, when we were talking about the study that we had embarked on, and we heard a lot of witnesses who talked about abuses in the system, and that there are consultants, ghost consultants or otherwise, who sometimes provide misinformation about their client's application, and sometimes that misinformation is provided unbeknownst to the applicant. They don't even know about that, right? And so when that happens, it is actually the applicant who is going to be penalized for that. And so hence, I would say that an appeal process is absolutely critical, because they need the opportunity to say, actually, that's misrepresentation that was put forward for me, unbeknownst to me, because they're not familiar with the system, they don't really know how the process works, or they have language difficulties, a whole variety of different other reasons, right? And so, and then on that point, it is absolutely essential that we have an appeal system in place, Mr. Chair. So I want to be clear about where I stood on that. It is not the applicant who should be penalized for that. It is the bad consultants who should take the hit on that. And right now, our system fails that, which is what our previous study was all about.
Thank you for those clarifications.
Thank you. So those are my points of order. And I do have one other piece, Mr. Chair, that I would like to raise, and that is with respect to the right to due process. I don't believe on all of this argument. I just want to be clear tying to these 2 points, and so there's no confusion about my point of view, and so that my privilege is not violated, and that is that I don't believe having the right to appeal really incents people to come forward and to fraud the system. I don't people think and say, hey, you know what, I think I'm going to think about how to fraud the system because I have the right to appeal. I don't think that. I think people, for some reason, if somehow they've been charged with the view that they have somehow misrepresented or presented fraud in their application, then they should have the right to appeal. That is our fundamental democratic right to have that due process in place. So, because sometimes, for example, officials make mistakes too, Mr. Chair, and when that happens, you should have the right to challenge the officials and say, you know, you don't know where you got that information from, but here are the facts of the case. And so, so appeals are really important. So anyway, I want to make sure that my privilege is not violated, and I want to put these issues on the record, seeing as my name was mentioned a couple of times.
Thank you for that clarification. Ms. Rumpel.
First of all, Mr. Chair, I want to express my deep respect for Ms. Kwan. I find her, even though we don't agree, we agree on much, actually. I find it surprising sometimes, but she always comes to committee very prepared, well thought out. You know, when she moves amendments on bills or different pieces of committee studies, they're very well rationed. And I guess, you know, where I want to go with my remarks, it's a nice bridge. My intent was not to misrepresent Ms. Kwan. It was more to show that, and I don't think I did, but I'm glad you clarified, was that the matter that's before us with regard to this amendment, the federal court ruling from Justice Gagné on the appeals process, and the amendments that we are going to be dealing with Bill C-6 that have come back from the Senate, they have wide-ranging implications both for people that are using our immigration system, as well as those who might be impacted by delays in the review process. This is a matter of real import. It's something that I think our committee time, you know, should be prioritized, given the fact that the clock is ticking on this. You know, one of the challenges that we have as parliamentarians is that we only have a finite amount of time in committee. You know, certainly Atlantic Canadian immigration is one of many issues that it comes before us, but there are times in which the committee has to say, look, certainly with this case, the minister has made no attempt to provide rationale on some significantly weighty matters. Ms. Kwan outlined her rationale for some of the things that she would like to see, and it's her job as an opposition member, just as it is mine, to hold the government to account. And I would like to remind government members as well that it is their job, if they don't hold a government appointment and are part of the government, to also hold the government to account. I would like to think that we can do something that resembles work with regard to this topic. I would like to see us ask the minister, you know, I'd love for Ms. Kwan to actually ask the minister where he's at with some of those points. The point that I'm trying to make today is not necessarily to build an argument one way or another, although I would like to do that at some point. My point is I don't have the information to be able to do that because I don't understand what the minister has done, for example, in response to the Auditor General's findings. I don't understand or know what advice he's being given in terms of potential appeals grounds. I don't understand the reason why there are fundamental system flaws in IRCC that have not been addressed over the last 2 years, especially since this amendment is not a surprise. I don't think. I mean, Ms. Kwan talked about the fact that she raised it. It's been a topic of discussion in the Senate for, what, over a year now since that's come up? And yet we've heard nothing from the minister on this, absolutely nothing. Look, I know that the minister is new. I know that he's busy, but this is a matter that Parliament is seized with. This is something that is of immediate and urgent import. And, you know, certainly, I'm not sure about Ms. Kwan. I'm happy to sit meetings during the summer if we need to look at other matters of urgent import, as we did last summer. You know, there's been allegations, Mr. Chair, of, you know, that when opposition members raise notices of motion, that, you know, somehow I've seen some of my colleagues say, well, this is a waste of time. I find that such an arrogant comment. And I would like to think that my colleagues in this room are beyond that, because it's very important to put the deliberations on these types of weighty matters as a priority of our committee. So, you know, with that, Mr. Chair, I would very, very much like my colleagues to support the minister to come to committee to answer these questions so that we as parliamentarians can do our give our best to our constituents and make informed, well-informed decisions, make well-informed decisions on their behalf based on the information that the minister has provided, which to date he has not done so. And with that, I close my remarks.
Thank you. Ms. Jarowitz.
Mr. Chair, I move that the debate be now adjourned.
Thank you. We'll now move to a vote.
The motion is that the debate be now adjourned. Mr. Fraser.
Yay. Yay.
Yeah.
Ms. Zarowich.
Yay, I think.
Ms. Lockhart.
Yay.
Mr. Tabara.
Yes.
Ms. Zahid.
Yes.
Ms. Rumpel.
Nay.
Mr. Soroya. Mr. Tilson.
No.
Ms. Kwan.
No.
Meeting's adjourned.
Sorry, before you do that, Mr. Chair, can I have
was
a
debate.
point of order?
Point of order, that was actually.
I have a point of order.
The motion was on my motion, not on the meeting to be adjourned, correct?
You've done it.
Meeting's adjourned.
Okay.
Hold on.
Thank you.